Hello, I would like to introduce you to Lecture 7 of Environmental 1401, and what we're going to be covering today is biodiversity issues, and that's going to be found in Chapter 12 of the 12th edition and Chapter 11 of the 13th and 14th editions of your book. So we're going to look a fair amount at what is biodiversity and the whole idea of biodiversity loss, and what is our value of biodiversity. And this we're going to cover a little in this lecture, but a lot more in a case study, which you'll have as a homework assignment. So to begin, when we look at biodiversity, um, we've defined this a little earlier in the semester, but again, this is variability among living organisms from all sources, and that means everywhere basically around our planet. And this includes creatures in the ocean, sea, whatever, but is basically somewhat of a measure of how much life there is on Earth and what variety of life is there and what type of habitats are also present on the Earth. So when we look at biodiversity, the types of it, we can distinguish it between what we call genetic biodiversity. And this just means we can look at the DNA of all the creatures, and that means trees, everything, insects, and look at the variety of DNA, and we'll see the importance of that, and also the variety of species that are present. That means individual creatures that we identify as individual organisms that appear to be similar and reproduce with each other. And another important concept is ecosystem diversity. That means looking at the variety of environments, large environments that we have on our planet. And this is particularly important when we look at the history of the Earth and how we've gone through these shifts in ecosystem diversity from being a primarily cold planet to a primarily hot planet. And now we have a fair amount of diverse environment. So there's a couple of ways we can measure biodiversity. And one term is called species richness. And by species richness, it simply put is how many number of different species make up an environment. And we can see here, there's one type of tree here in this upper environment, another type that makes two, that makes three, and this one here is actually a different than that one. That one looks a little scrawnier. So we have basically four types of trees with a species richness of 4. And then when we look below, down here, okay, what we find is a little different types of species richness. So we have 1, and this one was not present up there, 2, 3, 4, and then our little shrubby guy there, 5. So species richness is just looking at the diversity of species, because we find that some environments have many, 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 many species, while others have only a few. And that is more unique to the environment and that biome and ecosystem than anything else. It's not really an indicator of much of anything. Now, the way we do use species richness is over time, we could assess species richness over and over again. And our classes have done this in the past where we monitor stream creatures. And we can look at the different numbers that we collect year after year, and we can see if there's an increase or a decrease in the number of species that we've been collecting. Now, the next term is called species evenness. And with this, we're looking at two environments that do have the same number. So we see here, they each have these 4 different types of trees, but there's a different distribution of trees, a different evenness. So if you look at this diagram, we see that there's much more of a uniformity of the trees. We see about 25% of the environment is made up of an equal number of trees. Whereas here, this tree is the less prevalent tree, whereas that one makes up 70% of the environment. So, so species evenness and then something called species richness works into a factor called the biodiversity index or biodiversity value. So this is just, again, a way to measure, because evenness, again, varies with the environment, the type of environment. So like in aquatic communities, we might find one creature predominates the area. And in terrestrial ones, we might find some even ones, more typically. So this, again, varies. But now we can also measure this variance over time to see that if a particular species is doing well or not over a period of time. So we could use those principles of evenness and richness to look at genetic diversity. So basically the way we would measure this is we could look at the different organisms within an environment and look at what's called a population. That means a particular species that is present in this biodiversity area. So we can look at an individual species, again, the whole population, and look at the variety of genes that they have in them. And that means sort of like the variety of appearances, just like with people, we find a variety of appearances. And also with the snake that's hanging over my shoulder, we can find ones that have different spotting patterns, different degrees of coloration, and even albino ones that all make up that genetic diversity. And we've discovered that in ecosystems, when organisms have a high genetic diversity within their population, we find that this gives a lot of variation that could work for or against the creature. When we find low genetic diversity, the creatures are very similar. And in some cases, that can be very valuable. In other cases, that can be very bad. It all depends on the environmental conditions and the stability of an environment and whether there's impact on the environment. So in some cases, high genetic diversity is good. In some cases, it's bad. In the case of high genetic diversity, we can find that some creatures, very many of them die off due to variances in their traits that really, are not good for that particular environment. And we see this with creatures that have a very high reproductive potential, like oysters or snails. We find a lot of variety, and most of the ones that vary can die off. This is also true with butterflies. And sometimes a high enough genetic diversity can keep a creature from mating with others. When there's low genetic diversity, it could be negative if the environment changes and there's only one type of creature, what we call phenotype, that doesn't adapt to that environmental change, and all that species can die. That whole population can die off. In some cases, like cockroaches, okay, low biodiversity, they use it for their success, to be able to live amongst people and take advantage of our consistent environments. Bumblebees have been suffering from a rather moderate genetic diversity in that they have a lot of variety of genes, but they're lacking genes for pesticide resistance, which many other insects carry. So this is a very variable aspect to genetic diversity. And even in zoos, we pay attention to this because many zoo animals are bred from already captive species, and this creates sometimes a low genetic diversity that spreads disease. Genetic diseases, or I shouldn't say spreads it, but it basically enhances the population of genetic diseases that might be in those organisms. So how does genetic diversity occur? It occurs by mutations. That means existing genes change from generation to generation, and this could occur either frequently or not. Genetic diversity could occur through migration. That means a bird that carries genetic diversity of a place in Canada might fly to South America into a population that is genetically different than it, and they can actually enhance or detract from that population once their genes are introduced. And obviously, creatures that use a lot of sexual reproduction, like us, primarily sexual reproduction for many creatures, they're regularly introducing genetic diversity in their population, assuming that there's no inbreeding going on and that there is some mutation and migration happening. So why do we care about biodiversity? Because biodiversity is basically what gives us a lot of our resources. We'll look at this a little later. But our big concern is monitoring biodiversity of our Earth over time. And we have to be careful for the time periods we pick, because biodiversity does change. The Earth is shifting. The Earth is constantly changing. And that was evident in the first habitable planet. We live in a world of flux. And with things like global climate change possibly going on, human changes have been really altering the landscape for many creatures. So we pay a lot of attention to biodiversity loss and even gain in an ecosystem. And usually we look at loss as negative, because that means we're losing species or losing genetic variety, or in some cases losing ecosystems that can be very important. Now, sometimes an increase in biodiversity can mean that bad changes are occurring. Other creatures are being introduced that might disrupt it. Now, the overall extreme outcome of biodiversity loss is extinction, when we lose a particular creature in the environment. And this is almost true right now of creatures called cheetahs. They're at the brink of extinction. They also have a very low genetic diversity, which means that they have no room for any more environmental adaptation. They've lost the genes necessary to have the variety needed to survive in an environment. And the mating populations, again, are very small. So extinction means the species is gone. And the Earth has seen its share of extinctions. Literally, we have lost 99% of all the creatures in the Earth almost twice over in the history of Earth. And with humans now, we're seeing an acceleration of extinction that we've never seen before in our current lifespan since the last major geological extinction. But we're now calling what's called anthropogenic extinction. That means the changes that we're doing to the environment are creating negative impacts and killing off a lot of creatures that don't have the ability to. So when we look at biodiversity loss, the ultimate outcome that we really don't want to see is extinction. Okay, and maybe the extinction of certain disease organisms, but even then they might have a importance in ecosystems. So what we're seeing, guys, is that the Earth has lost about 99% of its species 2 times over in the history of the Earth. What we're seeing now is a unique type of extinction called the Anthropocene extinction, meaning that is created by human activity. And just in the past few hundred years, since humans have been developing technology, spreading about the world, we are increasing what's called our current natural background extinction rate. That means the extinctions that occur due to natural atmospheric and geological changes and natural interaction between creatures. We've increased this by 1,000 and 10,000-fold. And there's various reasons why this is occurring, we'll see. But we've lost about 1/8 of the birds that we should be having, 1/4 of the mammal species, 1/3 of the amphibians, it means turtles and salamanders, and half of the turtles and some other reptiles are disappearing at a rate that they shouldn't have, probably. Some of the work I'm involved in is monitoring coral reefs, particularly the one off of the coast of Texas, the Flower Gardens Banks National Marine Sanctuary. These are disappearing at a rate we've never seen before, and actually many of them should be growing. We're losing this unique area called mangrove forests, which you find the northernmost ones around Key West and throughout the Caribbean. These are very unique, rare habitats that are being lost 1% a year, and keep adding that up. In 100 years, they might be gone. And they harbor an incredible amount of unique organisms. It's beautiful to go through these. And so my best exploration was through the ones in Puerto Rico, looking at what's called the glowing waters and all the incredible wildlife that lives in there. The ones in Key West are also very unique and home to a miniature deer called the key deer. Okay. And we're learning that a lot of this biodiversity loss and extinction is directly correlated to our raising of crops. Crops literally supplant a lot of the predator-prey interactions, a lot of the habitat of many of these creatures, and contribute to pollution that is again contributing to the loss of these creatures. So a lot of this, we see there's many reasons for extinction, but we're finding out that probably one of the major ones is human agriculture. And this is now us pitting our own growing population and feeding it to the survival of other creatures. So when we look at extinction, we're going to see that some creatures are prone to extinction and others are not. I mean, we have creatures like cockroaches that, my gosh, they have taken advantage of human development, and boom, they used to be a tropical creature unique to, really deep tropical areas, and probably all originated from Africa. As a matter of fact, they might have migrated out of Africa with humans. They have a very close relationship with primates, and you'd rather not know that they live in the fur and the skin and on the skin. And in us, they probably did that too to our ancestors. We know today that cockroaches can travel in your clothing and with your material possessions. So they're very adapted to humans, and probably the more we do, the less prone they'll be to extinction, no matter how much we spray the heck out of them or try to step on them or whatever or control them. I know University of Florida is trying to study to look at how we can build our houses and grocery stores in a way that they don't encourage habitation by cockroaches. But guys, when we look at extinction, again, there are creatures that are more prone to extinction, others that are not. And what we pay attention to particularly are what are called local extinctions. That means extinctions close to human activities, okay? Because globally it's difficult to tell. So we tend to focus on this locally and look at particular human interactions. And this is what we're doing at the coral reefs when I go out on research trips, is we're looking at the effects of flooding, particularly human-induced flooding. I mean, from development, we look at the effects of pollution on our own coral reefs, because it's going to be different for the coral reefs in Puerto Rico while they're undergoing potential extinction, and the Great Barrier Reef, which is also undergoing potential extinction. So we tend to think locally, but we also pay attention globally, because the coral reef in our area in Texas, actually, its spawn originate from Cuba, from that area. So that means if that reef goes extinct, it could also affect ours. So sometimes we have to look at interconnections, but we still pay attention to what is going on in our area. So when we look at the different types of species that are subject to extinction, raccoons are on the list of probably not. They can live equally well in the forest. They could live equally well in a trash can, in any type of urban environment, any type of environment, suburbs, urban areas, whatever. I've seen them in New York City. Usually we mistake them for giant cats. So they, for just by sheer luck, have a broad range of tolerance of different things and have an incredible genetic variety that allows much adaptability. Cheetahs are the opposite. They are very highly specialized predators, very highly specialized in their environment. And if their prey disappears, if their habitat disappears, they're gone. And they also live in very small clustered populations. That means they're all basically inbred. And again, inbreeding's not bad, as long as your genetics fit your environment. But if that environment changes, these small populations go extinct. And we see this. We've seen this in Texas extinctions already with what are called horned toads, the Houston toad, certain types of ants have all disappeared. I mean, literally to the point of extinction. That means there's no breeding individuals left. Hawaii has seen many. This is very unfortunate and very typical on many islands that got colonized. So unfortunately, typically where humans settle, we tend to see a lot of local extinction going on. And what's really funny about local extinctions is, yes, the biodiversity index can go down, but sometimes we introduce other creatures that bring that biodiversity index up, or sometimes it causes introduction of creatures that doesn't change the biodiversity index. So it's really hard to see sometimes when we have things going on that affect the biodiversity, because we get a swapping of creatures sometimes, which totally can change that environment. So again, what is most likely the characteristics of a creature most likely to become extinct? And what we see here is creatures that tend to have a low population density, like I mentioned with cheetahs. Raccoons have the opposite, a high population density, which makes them less likely to become extinct. There's less individuals here, more individuals here involved in the breeding population. Typically, creatures confined to small areas are more likely to become extinct. Just like, again, with cheetahs, and which is just not true of raccoons, which are found over a wide area. And the same is true for coyotes, found over a very wide area. Some creatures have a specialized job in the environment, so highly specialized that they might eat only one food source or be pollinated by only one insect if it's a flower. And that could really wipe out a creature if the things that they're dependent on solely die off. Then we have creatures that have a generalized niche, and that's very typical again of raccoons. Okay, is they live in almost any type of environment. They can eat a variety of foods. They can live under various conditions from tropical to near Arctic. So this makes them very successful and very likely to carry on if one population dies off. And many creatures have a low reproduction rate. Other creatures have a high reproduction rate. A typical cheetah doesn't give birth to many children. Cockroaches, one cockroach in its 2 years of its life can give birth to millions of individuals, which you'd rather not hear. So what's a classic example of a creature that went extinct? And I'm not going to even try to pronounce the Hawaiian here, but this was a Hawaiian bird that disappeared with modern human habitation. And probably they were disappearing with initial human habitation too. So they fit this criteria of being on an island with a low density of them, very unique environment, specialized niche, and low reproductive rates. And my last visit to Hawaii, I found out that the Hawaiians are now very strict, particularly with birds, at protecting their birds. And you can't get close to the birds, you can't get into their habitats of these birds that fit this criteria. So they've measured, looked at their wildlife, and they're putting certain ones on their own protection list to make sure they don't disappear. So we've seen extinction in our own lifetime, and I've seen it, in my life, okay, studying different environments. Okay, so we can't put the blame totally on humans, but within our era of modern human civilization, particularly what I would say is probably around, the beginning of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the years of exploration, okay, right around the 1400s, at least European exploration, we have seen an unprecedented amount of extinction and also an unprecedented amount of biodiversity change. That means negative loss and also positive biodiversity gain. So as we modify the environment, and we mentioned earlier agriculture, but it means for housing, development, any of the things that we do to the land, this is always at the expense of an ecosystem. And that means also with the individuals within that ecosystem. And it can make the ecosystem incompatible with the creatures that are there and allow the introduction of other creatures or cause a total extinction and end up with a wasteland. So like you find in the Sahara Desert, which at one time was tropical, then more of a grassland, and then literally we believe got overgrazed by agricultural animals to the point where it is a nothing. We don't know the full story of that yet, but we believe that was the circumstances. And we see this in other areas too, small islands and whatever, that are literally eaten away by human activity and agriculture. So, human changes. Okay, the ability of humans to change the environment and migrate to new environments, okay, cause modifications in their world that have, again, negative impact, but sometimes positive impact for certain creatures too. But overall, it causes a biodiversity change that is not what we would typically see in the earth. So we look at activities like agriculture in particular. This is a biggie. Another biggie is human migrations. Humans are migratory creatures, even our ancient ancestors. So when we look at Homo sapiens, which is in red, look at what we have done. We have literally moved from a congested area throughout Africa, settled in Africa for a long period of time, and then did migrations to other areas and literally filled the continents, the places where we weren't before. And everywhere we went, we set up agriculture, we probably overhunted, we fished, we changed the area, like in fire-prone areas, we would chop down the grasses to make sure of no fire. In areas where we needed wood for construction of houses, we chopped down the trees. So we modified the landscape in many, many ways and caused unprecedented change. But look at even our near ancestors. We look at Neanderthals, okay, which I believe is in yellow. And even they did similar things around the same, a little earlier, and then about the same time we did, because we overlap with them. So they were also causing probably anthropogenic changes that were probably not as severe as ours because they never reached the point of technology. And the same is true for what we call Homo erectus, okay, which primarily inhabited this area with us. The Neanderthals are more along here. But all of us started out in this area and inhabited different environments. So we all had some impacts. But ours, what we call Homo sapiens, are the major contributors to what we see today in environmental. So just what are the human threats to biodiversity? Okay, so we categorize into 5 major groups. And one of the major groups is habitat loss. And again, this is where we see agriculture having a big impact, building dams for water or for water storage or for hydroelectric, building roads. This goes back to like, ancient history, even with the Romans and the Greek migrations, building roads and what we call corridors of travel, take away habitat. Urbanization, suburbanization, where we build industries, these are all causing habitat loss, and the harvesting of trees, you name it. We have taken up a fair amount of land, and all this habitat loss, of course, takes away from where creatures live. Overexploitation is basically typical of humans. Many civilizations have fallen due to overusing resources, and we tend to be very wasteful. In Northern European cultures, we tend to waste a lot of our freaking food. About 40% of it is thrown out because we don't want that part of the animal. We tend to overfish. We tend to have hobbies that are very environmentally unsustainable. There's all sorts of things we can look at. Very few creatures overexploit. Many creatures use resources, but it's moderated. We tend to overdo things, and this becomes a big issue because it creates a loss greater than what you would expect. We are wonderful at introducing what are called exotic species, which we sometimes call invasives, and that means creatures that include our wonderful little pets. Woo! Okay, that was bad. Okay, it looks like a cave painting lettering. Okay, so our pets, we introduce pets, they become feral, they get into the environment, we introduce pretty plants, we introduce crops. All of these replace other organisms in the habitat. And if these creatures get out again, they could compete with the local animals and put those creatures into extinction, or the local plants. And we look at it. When I was in Jamaica many years ago doing work, I was just amazed at the beautiful biodiversity and all the wonderful species of plants that I saw. And I learned that most of the Jamaican plants were gone and was replaced by plants that were imported from Africa and Asia to basically feed the slaves, and also to feed the locals too, the ship captains and the crew, as they collected crops from these different countries and felt comfortable with transporting them. So many exotics are accidentally introduced. For example, a tumbleweed, which is kind of funny because we look at it as indicative of the Old West, yet it was an introduced plant from the Mediterranean. It does not live in the United States, but now we find it as a regular feature that you even see in cowboy movies, okay, where tumbleweeds rolling across the plains. That tumbleweed should be rolling across Italy or Northern Africa or Spain, but not, Oklahoma and Texas and New Mexico. That was accidentally introduced by people growing flax crops, and some of the seeds from the tumbleweed got mixed in. We don't like a lot of creatures. We don't like pests that live in our house, bite us, eat our crops. And guys, when we eliminate these creatures, they play other roles in the environment. Mosquitoes can be nasty little boogers, and they can spread a lot of fatal diseases, incredible diseases, and probably spread some of the most infectious diseases on the earth. But they play a role. They're food for other creatures. And if we kill off every darn mosquito, even if we kill off every disease organism, we're going to find very negative consequences to this. And I've seen this when I was my first job out of my undergraduate, where I was working as studying parasites in fish exposed to pollution, and the pollution basically relieved the parasites from these fish by killing off other creatures that these parasites infected. So these fish, yeah, they were kind of healthier, but also they became overpopulated and just were destroying their own habitat by overeating the creatures they normally eat. And then we tend to kill off creatures we don't like predators. We spent a lot of time in this country killing off wolves and coyotes to protect our agricultural animals and also protect ourselves. And we also killed off hawks and other creatures because they would hunt chickens and small sheep. They can carry away a sheep, and even small cows at times. So we found that the consequences of this were dire. It increased rodent populations and other populations of pest creatures that spread disease. And even in Europe, part of the spread of plague was not just human migration, but also the killing off of predators that led to an abundance of rats that spread the plague. And last but not least is climate change. We have local climate change in cities. It's called urban heat island effect. It develops its own temperatures. It's incredible. Sometimes cities, particularly in the South, can be 20 degrees warmer than the surrounding areas just due to the presence of buildings and cement. We also have global climate change, which is very likely due to our own fossil fuel usage and other activities. Global climate change obviously is more dangerous because it could be a global threat to biodiversity. And many Polynesian countries and also Iceland and Greenland are looking severely at this right now, very seriously, that they're seeing the effects of some type of climate change that is unprecedented and not part of the normal cycling that we see. And they're losing their habitats. They're also losing their coastlines as ice is freezing in the north and ocean levels are raising in the around the Polynesian islands. So to kind of reiterate one of the most probably subtle biodiversity threats, because this is one that's hard to measure when we do mathematical calculations on what's called biodiversity index. But when we look at exotic or invasive species, that means ones that we introduced or by changing environment, some species came in from other areas and found that environmental change successful for them. So we see again that this causes very subtle changes that over time, can cause extinction or habitat changes. And we see this with something called the chestnut blight. We have lost almost every American chestnut tree and is replaced by ornamentals due to a disease that was introduced from Europe. Okay, and the same is true for Dutch elm disease. We have seen a disease from the Netherlands that during their explorations, they introduced and killed off most American elms, and it was replaced by local elms or other trees that are related to elms. And again, we can go on and on with these. Asian longhorn beetle replaced a lot of native insects to the point where it affected ecosystem structure. And we have present almost all throughout the world now this little Asian zebra mussel, which we find in some cases it could be bad in that they can clog up water pipes, sewer pipes, you name it. They can clog up nuclear power plant cooling pipes. Woo, that could be bad. They can clog up, small waterways, and they can replace local shellfish. What's funny, when I was up in around in what's called the Thousand Lakes area of New York State, right just south of like Montreal, Canada. The zebra mussel has taken over a lot of what's called the St. Lawrence Seaway. And what's really interesting is that it did replace a lot of local species, but the zebra mussel also cleaned up the water. And they've had the cleanest water since the major pollution occurred from the 1800s to the early 1900s in that body of water. So yes, zebra mussel is very negative, but again, sometimes these creatures have a positive value. So when we look at subtle biodiversity threats, the problem is sometimes there's a benefit, but overall there's probably not when we start messing around with introducing different creatures into an environment. So again, here are some different types of invasive creatures, and these you see around a lot. We see a lot of these in our country. These little guys, matter of fact, we just found one in the yard. That's the juvenile form of this. We see the Asian longhorn beetle. There's a zebra mussel, and this is called Eurasian milfoil, and this came about actually from fish tanks. People would buy this for their fish tanks. It would get overcrowded, so they'd walk over to a neighborhood pond and dump it in the pond or just throw it in the toilet, and sometimes the stuff got into a septic system and got out. A lot of these were just introduced by transportation, or particularly the zebra mussel came on ships, ship ballast. These can come on boats and ships, particularly when we're transporting agricultural products. So a lot of these are not intentional. Something called kudzu, which is a very aggressive vine, which is literally taken over in the south and causing a lot of farm loss and biodiversity loss and property loss, was introduced as an ornamental because it grew quickly, and if you have a crappy yard like mine, it can take over your whole yard. Unfortunately, it will overgrow your house. It will overgrow over your uncle sitting in the backyard. I mean, it is a very aggressive plant. Some other invasives we see are sometimes ones that we actually have gotten used to. Okay, so what's interesting is that what we see in the United States is we had a pest little fish called the brook lamprey. It was replaced equally by a sea lamprey, which again was introduced by ship travel. Okay, the trout that our ancestors used to hunt is gone and has been replaced by the brown trout, which we're equally happy with. And the same as the rainbow trout, which a lot of fishermen catch, and we also see selling at the grocery stores as an invasive that took over and replaced the brook trout. And we can go on and on of fish we think, and other, particularly fish in general, is the basis of this, that are, these were very common at one time, and these replaced them basically, and most of us didn't notice the difference. Now, of course, walleye, I mean, that's a big fish in the north particularly, and I know that in Minnesota I have some of the best almond-crusted walleye. It's a very unique fish, but it is going out of existence and replaced by a fish called a roughy, which doesn't have the same taste, okay, and it's basically not as valuable. So sometimes we don't even notice what's invasive and what is not. And this was very typical when I would travel. I'd always be amazed at the variety of creatures I'd see in these different environments, and then learn later that they were invasives. And going, oh my gosh, half of the Caribbean is made up of African and Asian plants. And half of Hawaii is introduced plants from parts of Asia and the United States. So, as an environmental scientist, what do I do to protect biodiversity? The problem is that I can't tell people to stop farming, to stop harvesting resources. I have to fight with economical reasons. Economy gets priority over ecosystems and beauty and all of that type of stuff. And we have to save the owls. No. If we have to do something that's going to affect the owls and it's economically important, we're going to say screw the owls. So what we've developed is this term called ecosystem services. And with ecosystem services, okay, what that looks at is what are some value to an undisturbed ecosystem that we have been totally dependent on and we don't know it. So ecosystems can have a value. That means an ecosystem service. That's what it means. That it does something in nature that we didn't know we were getting derived benefits. So when we start farming and destroying soil for housing, industry, whatever, building dams, we see that we lose creatures that put nutrients in the soil. And if we even plant the wrong crops, we can lose the plants that encourage, let's say, what are called nitrogen-fixing bacteria to do their job, and we end up having to fertilize. We end up with soils that are low in productivity. We've actually seen farmland go to crap because there's no plants left that help to produce natural fertilizers in those soils. So what do? We add fertilizer. And it's very expensive to get. It's very polluting. We learned that by disturbing soil, we destroy the creatures like earthworms and things like moles and whatever, and certain insects and other worms that build that soil. We can end up with what are called dead soils. That means the soils don't do the job that the soils should, and we'll learn about soils a little later. Okay, so we see that, guys, many, ecosystems provide us with things that we didn't know we were dependent on. Various factors that are invisible to us. And again, this includes things like nutrient cycling. Okay, that was covered in a previous slide, but it's kind of a little reiteration here, because not only do nutrients are found in the soil, but nutrients cycle through the water and also through the atmosphere, and any disturbance could affect that. We're seeing a loss of cultural uses of the environment. Guys, it's okay to say, hey, ecotourism, environmental tourism is great. Guys, we've learned from a survey in Houston that when people move to a large city, They don't want a large city. They want to have green space. They want to have someplace close that they can go to and get into nature. So by destroying all of nature with these large megacities, that has a negative impact on our cultural use. Uh, um, it could also provide unique organisms that we like for bird watchers and things like that. For hunters, that's a cultural use. Uh, um, and whatever. And in some cases, like with indigenous populations, including our Native Americans, they have spiritual value to certain ecosystems and to certain organisms. We've learned around here that certain environments allow water regulation. You remove a lot of forested areas and start grazing over the habitat and building houses and stuff, we find out that water diverts itself sometimes and causes flooding. So a lot of the flooding we've seen here was due to a loss of environments that tend to absorb the water and re-divert it. And by building suburbs and cities, we're diverting a lot of rainwater into us. Yes, we build drainage to go with it, but that rain sometimes comes in at rates that the drainage can't do its job. And unfortunately, sometimes by building agriculture, we need so much water for agriculture, we divert it from other areas too, and we end up with droughts, the opposite of flooding. And of course, we affect water by affecting its quality through pollution, through industrial and domestic use. Okay, what else are the value of ecosystems? Because why is this important to go through? This is what we try to tell politicians. This is what we try to tell people. Is we say this is what an ecosystem do. This is what ecosystems do. And what we typically do too is we say this is the cost of not having it. Look at the cost of the flooding we had here. So our developing certain areas to the point where, and our damming of areas that creates this buildup of water, and the removal of trees and other habitat that absorb water and take it out of the rivers. Look at the flooding it did. Look at the millions of, literally hundreds of millions of dollars of damage just to us alone. And it's not including the damage of where the waters flowed into and the damage to the oyster beds in the Gulf of Mexico with all the fresh water that just washed in at once. So we can put a price on that too. So environmental disturbance is a very important thing because we can actually add a value to that eventually. The environment is a natural waste cleaner. Now, of course, not to the point where it cleans up every darn pollutant, but it can do it slowly and it can do it carefully. And we got to be careful about that. The more environment we remove, the more the ability of the environment to clean itself. And of course, what's important too is for many people, environments are a source of food and raw materials. If we use it prudently to the point of not destroying the environment, we will always have those materials. The problem is, and I've seen this like in Bangladesh and in some of the Caribbean countries and parts of Asia, is that people tear down these raw materials and obtain the food faster than it can replenish. And you don't destroy the ecosystem that is giving you that service. Okay, and we can go on and on with this. Ecosystems alter the atmosphere in a way that has a benefit for us. Okay, again, it's also an area for recreation, natural areas, and very important, what are called biological control services. This unfortunate little booger here, those white things right there are parasitic wasps. Basically, it's the baby of a wasp that's sitting in there. What it's going to do is live off of that caterpillar. The caterpillar's right there, and it's going to get inside and eat the flesh of the caterpillar as the caterpillar is getting fat and slowly dies by having its guts sucked out. Isn't that a nice way to die? It's very slow, progressive, and I don't know if the caterpillar knows what's going on or not. Okay, I don't know if there's any pain to it or stuff like that. I mean, I hate to have something like that on me. So, guys, these caterpillars, their only population control or major population control might be those wasps. And if that caterpillar got out of control, it could deforest an area and lose a whole habitat or sometimes destroy a whole biome. So we see that many organisms play biological control, predator, prey, other things like that, disease organisms, you name it. So These again are all ecosystem services. We also see bumblebees, which are, and honeybees, which are basically becoming endangered lately, are very important pollinators. And what's really important is they pollinate our crops. We're seeing now that, guys, by spraying pesticides, what we call general spectrum pesticides on farms and houses, whatever, it kills off bees. And unfortunately, bees don't have the genetics to fight pesticides. That's one bad thing about their genetic or gene diversity, as they are missing the genes for it. Matter of fact, we're trying to do research to introduce the genes into these bees without making them too much of a problem. And so what happens is bees are dying off, which is affecting other things that eat the bees, obviously, and it's affecting the flowers that are pollinated exclusively by bees, including our own crops. So we're having to find out that farmers actually have to bring in bees. They have people to make money trucking bees into a farm and then collecting the bees later when they're done and putting them back in a semi and driving from farm to farm. And of course, ecosystems play habitat or refuge, what we call nursery to many creatures. So we can destroy an environment not knowing that it is a site for populating other environments. This is true of butterflies in Mexico. A lot of bird habitat is in South America, and if we destroy the birds down there, those birds would eventually migrate north, and if there's none left to migrate north, it could affect distant environments. So again, all of these are ecosystem services. Okay, and this goes on and on. Now, another important one, I know this goes on and on, is what are called genetic resources. And your book doesn't, well, your book does mention this, but this is a picture I included. Guys, just about 10 years ago, a bunch of agricultural researchers had to get on a plane, go into war-torn Afghanistan, and risk their life to hunt through the mountains to find the ancient native wheat that was originally cultivated by humans, about 8,000 years ago. The wheat from our ancestral cultures is different from the wheat today. We genetically bred modern wheat to be nice and fat and juicy, but also free of certain genes that make them fight off disease and drought. So what happened is that our wheats were dying. We were dying from diseases and drought that were, making a wheat deficit. We had to actually import wheat for a while because we couldn't make enough for ourselves. And these researchers had to fly in, collect the ancient wheat, which are still growing there, in Afghanistan and remote areas, and bring back the DNA and insert it into modern wheat to give them the modern wheat the various protection it needs today. So we like to keep what are called genetic resources. And we have a bunch of people, researchers, that collect plants and animal DNA from over the world and freeze it, or they freeze seeds, and they store that DNA for future use. It'd be funny if we did this for ancient people, because we do have Neanderthal DNA and stuff like that now, that we could use their genes one time to even help ourselves maybe in the future through gene therapy. Again, we talked about this earlier. Another ecosystem service is soil formation. Okay, without certain ecosystems, we don't get a variety of soil. And guys, sometimes soil is transported. That means it's formed in one place and then. So let's put an end to the doom and gloom and look at what the heck are we doing about environmental preservation. And the end of your chapter covers this pretty detailed. And I don't want to beat this issue dead in the PowerPoint. So please, read your book about this. So what we have to do when we look at environmental preservation is we have to take it a step at a time and very slowly and prioritize and put our efforts into where we really see would give us the best value. So what we do is come up with priorities or categories of how to approach this and where do we put our money to get the best value. So what we can do is categorize organisms and environments according to a priority. And one of those priorities is called endangered. And that just means basically these are at the point of going to extinction or disappearance, and we find value with this creature or environment. It might be a key environment, a key creature, and this is where our efforts are going to be right away. And then we have other categories like vulnerable, or sometimes we call this threatened. And this means I don't want this to reach this. So I'm going to put something into that, but again, less priority than above. And again, the same can be said for this category and this category. This category in general, we tend to leave it the status quo. These are resources that we continue to exploit for a while, but we also try to do it in a sustainable way. So when we talk about sustainability and where do we put small changes over time, like looking at alternative energies or reducing our resource use, this category we could work with over a slow period of time. But these get more priority. Again, as I always end this, if you have any questions, please send me an email to my D2L or leave a voicemail on my office phone, and I'll try to get back. The best thing, again, is through email.